This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. Regular listeners will know that I recently interviewed Chloe Taylor, who is one of the academic editors of the series, as well as Richard Twine, who is the author of a recent entry in the series, which is called The Climate Crisis and Other Animals. If you missed those other episodes, I encourage you to look back through our archives and have a listen. On today's episode, however, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr Pablo P. Castello, who is currently a research fellow in the Animal Law and Policy program at Harvard Law School. His interdisciplinary research on animals and politics has included published work in venues as diverse as the American Political Science Review, Biological Conservation, and the feminist philosophy journal Hypatia. Today, however, we're going to talk about his paper, The Fabric of Zoodemocracy, a systemic approach to deliberative zoodemocracy, which was published online in 2025 in the Critical Review of International Social and Political Philosophy, which is normally known as CRISPP. Welcome to the podcast, Pablo.
Thank you so much, Josh, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So can you start by telling us what led you to work on this project?
So really, all this began with my PhD thesis. The initial question I was very interested in when I began my PhD it revolved around kind of a triangle. I like to explain it as a triangle, which was the relationship between language, subjectivity, and the recognition of violence. So, in the animal rights movement and animal rights theory, there is this slogan, and this more than a slogan, it's a phrase we use a lot, that seeing is believing, that if people truly knew what happens in factory farms, then political transformation would follow, right? There's this quote by Paul McCartney, very famous, about, if a lot of houses had glass walls, if everyone saw, then we would all go vegetarian. That was for me a puzzle, because today there are less vegans and vegetarians on aggregate than in 1999. If we look at in relative terms, rather than absolute terms. And in my undergrad, this question about how language subjectivizes humans not to recognize violence was quite important. We looked at some texts that centered that. So my initial project was to study this. But one of the frustrations I had with the fields of critical theory, or the critical traditions, and continental philosophy that were my primary expertise was in those areas, was that they were not proposing any alternatives. So they provided fantastic theories to understand the nature of oppression and violence and epistemic violence and all these things. But it was unclear then, once we do all this deconstruction and understand how all these oppressions are operating and why we cannot see, the question was, how can we see? So this article could be in part understood as a response to that question. So in part, the motivation of the article is to create the epistemic conditions to see animals in their full ethical weight. And that includes visibilizing, rendering visible that the lives of animals are social and political too. And so the notion of this fabric of zoodemocracy tries to already touch into that and try to capture some of those dimensions of the, if you like, sociopolitical lives of animals. We need to track them, to study them, to try to capture them through, hopefully, academic work. So anyways, I hope that explains a little bit about the motivation.
Yes, and at the end here, you introduced this idea of, at the end of your answer to that question, you introduced this idea of the fabric of zoodemocracy, and that's very much the central insight of this paper. So I guess there's two questions here. What exactly is zoodemocracy, and what does the fabric of zoodemocracy refer to?
So if we think about, this is how the article begins. So community members, we usually do all sorts of things that sustain, if you like, the socio-political fabric of our communities. So to be more concrete, we cooperate with each other. We help our neighbors. Someone may ask you on the street, where is the train station? And you may kindly indicate them where it is. And when you, even if one thinks only about that action, that's already imbued by many social norms. You will speak with a certain tone of voice. You will not be screaming. The gestures you will do with your hands will not be like, very effusive. They will be perhaps slow, or I don't know, something. And all that, there are norms that are shaping those interactions. So what this notion of the fabric of zoodemocracy tries to do is to sort of identify the necessary elements and the sufficient elements to sustain this socio-political fabric that holds our democratic communities together, as it were. So Donaldson likes to speak of the glue that holds their community together, right? It's another kind of metaphor. And then, importantly, the fabric of zoodemocracy does not necessarily imply, in the discussion we're going to have now, one of the things that I noticed when I was explaining this is that people got confused between what I call the fabric of zoodemocracy and a zoodemocratic system as such, which I think it's what the first question was about. So one of the things that I say in my talks is that non-human animals, in my view, have many of the capacities that are necessary to sustain our democratic communities, but that they on their own could not co-author a zoodemocratic system. So a zoodemocratic system, one of the things, this is also perhaps important to frame my intervention, the work of Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka is essential to answer that question. For me, I just situate my work within the zoopolitical project, provisionally at least. It doesn't need to be that ideally this should be so, but initially I accept more or less the liberal democratic order that we have with the state apparatus, etc. And from that point of view, of course, it involves the rule of law, having institutions such as a Supreme Court justice, parliaments, and so on. And obviously, animals have no clue of what is a Supreme Court, what's a parliament, what's an election, all sorts of human types of protest that they would have no clue about what's going on with that. Of course, they cannot participate in that, in some of these institutional mechanisms or democratic processes. But the question is whether they can, nonetheless, participate in some political processes and whether some of their actions, rather than political processes, the way I frame my intervention, because I had one of the reviewers, and we will get into this, I suppose, later in our conversation, really targeted the idea of political action. They had a problem with that. I used the language of political action, and then I got rid of the language of political action and political participation and only spoke of actions and forms of participation that should be taken up by our political institutions. Whether that's a political action or not, it's a different discussion and debate. The question is, are there certain actions that should be taken up by our political institutions? If we do this, if we take up some of these actions, do they help us to build a more just democratic society? That's more or less what some of the things that we may discuss. But I'm not sure if I'm being clear or I'm already getting into our previous conversation from last Friday, because Josh and I, listeners will be hearing us and they don't know this. We had a talk on, both of us were in a panel for the American Philosophical Association, a meeting in the States, and we got into a debate on this very topic. So maybe I'm already advancing the conversation we already had, I don't know.
And of course, I'm very happy to continue that debate, and maybe we will arrive at that shortly. But I suppose let's focus on this zoodemocracy and the fabric of zoodemocracy first, because a first question is, well, which animals are we talking about here?
Right.
So Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka quite famously hold that most of the political interactions we have with animals are with domesticated animals. Is that similar for you? Are they the kinds of animals who are part of the zoodemocracy and contribute to the fabric of the zoodemocracy?
Right. Yes, I because my work is situated, I just accept the division. At least I have doubts about domesticated animals and liminal animals if and when. Well, maybe I should explain first the differentiated theory for those who are not familiar with this. So Donaldson and Kimlicka argue that political relations, the way that we should establish political relationships with animals, should be divided into three groups or categories or types of relationships. One is with domesticated animals, because they live in our communities, they have made a life of their own in human-animal communities, they contribute to reproduce the, if you like, social fabric of these communities through emotional support, through their labor, by complying with social norms. Then they say these are, if you like, the reasons that can justify recognizing domesticated animals as community members. If one contrasts domesticated animals with animals like dogs or cats, our companion animals, with say what they call liminal animals, animals that reside in cities such as squirrels or foxes or whatnot, these are the animals, they do indeed reside in the same, if you like, spaces as humans, but they have not been socialized into human-animal communities. They lead a life that is primarily on their own. Squirrels in their trees, foxes roaming around the cities, rabbits the same, and so on. So they say for liminal animals, they should have certain rights to residency and other things, but they shouldn't have the full set of rights that a citizen would have, which is what would happen in the case of the domesticated animals, right? And then the last category is for wild animals. They claim that wild animals have their own forms of social organization. They live independently outside kind of human communities, far away. They do not want to interact with humans. They are capable of leading a life of their choosing, and they are competent agents who can manage their affairs in their own terms. And that's why they argue these wild animals should have an interest in self-determination. They should have a right to self-determination, and even beyond that, a right to sovereignty, they claim. And then we should see them as their own. They are nations. When we go into their territories, we should think of ourselves as tourists who access to the territory of another nation. And that's how they speak of wild animals in those terms. So I more or less, at least for the purposes of this article, I take it for granted that their theory is correct. And then my intervention focuses exclusively on the case of domesticated animals.
Good. So we're thinking primarily about domesticated animals. And I want to go back to this example of giving directions to a train station. Because
Right.
as we know, animals, or as you suggest, animals can understand high court judges or electoral systems or that kind of thing, but they also can't really give directions to train stations. So what's the equivalent for them? What kind of activities do they undertake that maintain this fabric of zoodemocracy?
I don't know if you would like us to get into the ethnographic work I did maybe later, but one thing that people may be familiar with, actually animals are capable, it's interesting, domesticated animals, of giving directions to humans. For example, there are all these cases where a dog's human companion is very ill. Sometimes they may have heart attack or something. And then the dogs will go outside the house, draw attention from a human, kind of try to guide them to the house. We have instances of this. And they very deliberately say, come with me, right? To humans they may know, until they go to the house and then they realize, oh my goodness, this person needed assistance. And then they may call an ambulance or whatnot. So in fact, domesticated animals can give directions. They are capable of doing that. Obviously, in a more everyday life sense, they do that all the time to us when they say, I want to go for a walk. And then a dog may look at the door, may begin, I think you call it whining, if I am not mistaken, right? Saying, I want to go out. Why don't you, open the door? And then once you open the door, because they may look at you, they may look at the door, they are not, okay, now we are fine. And they stop whining, they will be happy, moving the tail or whatever. They are capable of giving directions. It's just, they cannot give directions about a train station as humans may be able to do so. But there are also these cases that it's different because it's on their own, but were these dogs in Russia that they learned to get into the underground, go to a certain place, a different neighborhood in that particular stop, leave that stop, go to eat food, then go back with the underground, go to their home, and then go and sleep in a different neighborhood using the underground. So they are capable of much more often than we would imagine.
Well, that's fascinating. And one of the real insights that you've got here in this paper We might talk about methodological innovation shortly. But what you've actually done is you've spent time at an animal sanctuary and suggested that through that kind of work, we can learn something quite significant about animals' contributions to democratic procedures, or at least the fabric of democratic procedures.
So I spent about a total of 8 weeks at the Vine Sanctuary. It's a sanctuary for formerly farmed animals in Springfield, Vermont, in the United States, an LGBTQ-led sanctuary. And these are really, in some respects, I don't know if unique, but at least unusual sanctuary, because in this particular sanctuary, they assume, and one of the elements of their ethos is that the domesticated animals residing in the sanctuary have an interest in self-determination, in making their own decisions, and they make an effort to enable the agency of the animals. And this goes from the infrastructure they build to the fact that they do not separate animals by a species, and the animals roam freely, they are not trained to obey human orders, and that space has enabled the animals to really, among themselves, and here I mean human and non-human animals, the whole mixed community, one could call it, multi-species community, to co-author social norms of their own. That the problem is, because I have just begun this research and we don't have a lot of research on this, my strong suspicion is that the norms of Vine's multi-species community, if we had another multi-species community that assumed the same ethos, created the same conditions, we would probably see different norms, as it happens with different human communities. We've just had I don't think we have had the time to do this kind of research. But the idea then is that I have conducted an ethnography as well, a multi-species ethnography. This is worth highlighting because it's not quantitative research as I could have done, mapping, say, where the animals move or how some people have done that work. Rebecca Shen, a researcher here at Harvard, also did that. She's an architect. In my case, because I was interested in the political dynamics that unfold in this community, I thought that an ethnography was the right kind of methodology, because with an ethnography, it's a qualitative type of research in which the researcher is immersed in the community, you participate in it. To some extent, you are socialized into the community's norms. And that's actually, we could talk for a whole podcast on this, on how I became progressively changed and was assimilated the norms and began to see that I could read the animals' movements. I could anticipate how they were going to move, when they were going to stop, all sorts of things. And they also began to see that I knew how to do that and would also respond to me differently as time passed. And I think that's really important because, of course, as students, we speak of things like social norms or resolving conflicts, as we may talk in a second. All that stuff, I don't want to say it's political, but it begins to tell us something about how a socio-political community can operate with domesticated animals, or how it could if one day, how it could not, how it does already operate that point. It already exists. That's one of the beautiful things about this, that sometimes we think that this research is very utopic, futuristic, it will never happen. But we already have some traces in some communities that are already exist, right?
I think the point about the way that you yourself learned these norms is really interesting, because that seems to be a crucial part of this fabric of zoodemocracy idea, or the fabric of democracy, in that you need time to get into it. But it also suggests that animals' contributions to this might already be quite widespread in ways that we just haven't started to notice yet.
Yes, I completely agree. Yeah, it's in a way I feel, and this is related to the motivation, how we began this podcast. So to some extent, the ontological, epistemic, and sociopolitical conditions to see animals as beings who are already participating or contributing to sustaining this fabric of zoodemocracy are not there. They have not been there. We've seen domesticated animals and animals in general as being outside the realm of politics altogether. That's why the work of people such as yourself and myself, we work in this subfield of animal rights theory called the political turn. And this is what it tries to focus and render visible, that the relationships that human and non-human animals already have are political in nature, and we need to study them and render them visible. And if you like change our gaze, it's a different way to look. I think you said something like that at some point. A different way to understand what human-animal relationships can involve, and what they already involve. It's just that we begin to read this reality differently, with a different lens. Maybe that's a good way to put it.
And I also really like this point that you make about how different communities might evolve differently. That's the nature of democracy, right? It's different communities choosing their own way. So what kinds of particular developments or particular innovations or particular relationships did you find at Vine that you think we really should be paying attention to?
One thing that surprised me about Vine was that from my first field work was in 2021, and the last one was in 2023. And in those 2 years, quite a few changes happened, because one of the things that happens in sanctuaries is that animals die all the time, and new members come into the community all the time. And also the community right now at Vine is quite old. It's most animals are quite old at the commons. And so I saw a very significant shift in the community from the 2021 fieldwork to the 2023. And one of the reasons, there are other reasons, but one of them was that animals aged. This literature as well on old animals that is beginning to grow progressively, and it's super interesting. And the role of old animals and the eldest members of a community in the community, what roles do they have? Anyways, the thing is, of course, when you have a community that is older, and most of the animals in the community are older, the energy, as it were, the vibrancy, also everything slows down. Things are not as you know, and the animals are not as energetic. They may not play as much. They may not run as much. And that changes some of the dynamics. So it's interesting also to just think about that a community, of course, can be a community composed of more older, the members may be older or younger, how that changes things. But just to answer your question in a more straightforward way, one of the things that I really liked witnessing was how the community received newcomers. And I just found that's such a great way to understand the norms of a community. Because these newcomers, I will give the example I gave in the article, but there are other cases. So there is Marble and Pumpernickel. These two animals, they were goats. Well, they are goats. They still live at Vine. And when they came into the community, they had not been socialized in any community before. They had just been raised by a human being who had them as pets. And they just didn't know. It's interesting to think, this is one of the things that is really sad, and also to some extent then interesting when you do this research. The sad part is that these domesticated animals, they are social animals. We just give for granted that we humans are raised in community. We learn all sorts of stuff about how to socially interact with each other. Although some might find interacting with others easier than other people, but you know what I mean, right? About how, in our case, how to speak, things about body language, as I was explaining with the train case, right? There are all sorts of things that we learn just by being brought up in society. Well, these social animals, these specific two goats, and this is kind of it's very common amongst with the animals that arrive to Vine, that they had never been socialized. They had not been socialized, and when they arrived to Vine, they just didn't know how to interact with other animals, and they were literally not ostracized, but they were sort of, people were not other animal people. They didn't want to play with them. They tried to eat from the herring, that is the place where they can eat the best food, and they were not being allowed to eat from the herring. They would headbutt them all the time. And that was because they were acting in ways that were very odd. So they would position themselves behind other members of the community before eating from the herring. So, usually when goats want to eat from the herring, because in the herring, there are sheep, goats, and cows primarily eating there. Sometimes the alpacas go there, and the pig also goes there from time to time, or a chicken or something. But usually, a hen or rooster, but usually it's those three species, members of those three species. And the way they do it is they will go next to someone rather than behind. And then they will just, and where there is also a place that is empty, that no one is eating from that place, because they like that their space is respected, to have their own space to eat, which I think is something that would probably interest you a lot, Josh, because of your work on property. So anyways, the point is, when they would position, and I also thought people really like listening to this because it's something that we empathize a lot with this. When someone is looking at you from behind, you know this feeling we've had sometimes that someone is looking at you, and then you suddenly you turn around and you're like, what's going on? And indeed, someone was looking at you, but it's a feeling, you feel weird, it's odd, it's like, we don't usually like that. So I think that the animals felt the same thing because they would stay behind. Let's say that the pumpernickel was behind Rose, that was one of the cows, and the cow initially would not realize, but at some point they would turn around, kind of noticing someone seems to be looking at me from behind, and they would see that they were pumpernickel or marble were there, and they would just indicate them, go away, by trying to headbutt them sometimes, otherwise headbutting them. And also, they would always try to eat from the same spot where someone else was eating, which the rest would very rarely do. And they would always try to do this. So then they also were headbutted and say, you should not do that. And this was in 2022. But in 2023, when I went to the sanctuary again, that's why it's important, I think, to do fieldwork that involves different moments in time. I conducted fieldwork in 3 years. It was an entirely different dynamic. They had completely, they were, if I had only conducted fieldwork in 2023, I would have not noticed a single difference between them and the rest of the community members. They didn't do these weird things of, staying behind other people. They would just, go to eat next to someone else. They didn't try to eat as often from where others were eating. They played with other residents. They had made new friends. They would sleep together and, cuddle with others, like what the animals do at Vine usually. So I think it's really interesting to think about how a community receives newcomers, how they are progressively initiated into the norms of the community, how they learn those norms, because social learning is, of course, very important for all social animals. Yes, and that's just one example. There are other examples in the text and in the data I gathered. But I think that one, I really like that example. There are many elements there that are helpful, I think, too.
And that's a fascinating case. I suppose my question is, so how do we link that back to the issue of zoodemocracy?
One of the key, I think with conflict resolution is perhaps easier, it's more direct. But I also think this one in a more positive sense is very important. So one concept that I like a lot, and I touch on in this article, but I'm going to write an article on this concept exclusively, is the interaction order by Erving Goffman. Goffman was a sociologist, and he said that many of our everyday interactions are shaped by social norms, and that our body plays a key part in this. And importantly, if you like, I remember Will told me this at some point, and I think it was very wise. To some extent, the interaction order of any community, but even at the level of a family, a group of friends, whatever one wants to target, any social structure that one wants to target, is always very fragile. It can always be dismantled, fall apart, and if I say in the article literally that these kinds of actions of learning new norms, etc., are essential to sustain these democratic communities, and that without these kinds of actions, the fabric of these communities would fray, they would unravel, fall apart. So if you think about, say, a family context, and this happens in families sometimes, it's sad when this happens, but it can happen. There can be, a family may have a fantastic relationship as a unit for, a family of, let's say, 15, 20 people with different siblings, the children, the grandparents, everyone. And then there is this one event where the interaction order is threatened by a huge argument that can indeed break the family. We know cases of this kind. And it's really, and the same applies, I think, to a democratic community. So it's really important that we are always, as it were, whether it is intentionally or unintentionally, trying to keep the communities together, trying to contest center norms, but also comply with other norms when they are unjust or whatever thing. So the way that all these things that I explained earlier relates to the fabric is this. If marble and pumpernickel had kept just trying to distort the dynamics of the community. And this, with some animals, this is a problem sometimes. So some of the animals are very traumatized. They can never get into, and that's a problem. And in the human case, that can also be a problem. There are some cases where, unless the persons learn to behave in community, to behave in society, and to comply with norms, it's also important to contest them. But the compliance is, if you like, we need to feed constantly our communities for them to work. And it happens with family, with friendships. We also know these cases, right? Unless one contributes, it's always trying to take care of the friendship, care for it, invest time on it. It can fall apart. And something very similar happens, and we know this in the US right now with Trump and company. So because part of this is the idea that we always need to work to ensure that our democracies do not fall apart. And one aspect of this is not the only one. There are a lot of aspects, and I touch on many others in the article about protest, conflict resolution, and other things, cooperation. It's really all these things that usually we just give them for granted are crucial, are just essential. Without that, it's just a police cannot operate at all.
You identify how there's this very wide range of different things that are going on. And I've heard you say in other contexts that there's kind of a lifetimes of work here in this
Yes.
fabric of zoodemocracy idea. So what would that look like? Is it just a case of identifying each of these features and then exploring how animals might instantiate them?
I thought about this, but the thought is not fully mature. Indeed, one part of this is to identify what elements are. I have, I think I told you before, I have an A4 page which with that I call it the clouds kind of map or something, where there is fabric of zoodemocracy is the center, and then imagine many clouds around it with all sorts of concepts about cooperation, agency, protest, non-compliance, co-authorship of norms. But there is a lot to be discussed in that space, and a lot of other things. Like I have, I don't know, 30 or 40 concepts. I will never finish that project, I don't think. It's a work that hopefully others can contribute to it. But one part is to just identify them. What are those elements? Reciprocity. And then once we have the elements, some of these elements, which is something I have not done yet, are related to each other. I give this example at the beginning of the article where I say that cooperation is co-constituted, hence the notion of fabric. The threads are kind of enmeshed, or they form a whole, as it were. So if we think about cooperation is going to involve some kind of communication with another person or more than one person. It's also going to involve certain norms that enables us to cooperate. Coordination, that there is a shared goal. All sorts of things related to cognition and consciousness are playing part in here. Decision making, we are making decisions while we cooperate, of course. We are agents, right? That's the agents can cooperate. So, and all that, it's only in this one. So you take cooperation exclusively, and it unfolds into 5 or 6 or 7 threads. And then how is this working exactly? And that I'm talking about cooperation exclusively, but you can take any of the concepts of the fabric and do that with each of them. And then you go and you do ethnographic work, and you try to map each of the threads, try to explore them, dig into that, and then which is what you are kind of pulling me to do, which is great. I love that you are doing this. How does this connect to the fabric writ large and to the system as well? So how do we move from one level to the another, the micro to the macro level? So that's what I think needs to be done. So we need the elements as kind of their own bubbles, their own clouds. We need then to see how different threads unfold into 5 or 6 threads. How then, if you take one cloud here and one cloud and certain actions here, and which in the article I try to do it, but I think a lot can be done in terms of saying, okay, Marble and Pumpernickel, they assimilated certain norms in the community. There were these other animals that were solving conflicts. So how does all this together? And that's why the systemic turn in democratic theory is super important, because they try to tell us we need to be attentive to how each of these actions is helping us to sustain the larger cooperative scheme, if you like, the system of cooperation in general, rather than only seeing as this isolated action. It's more like the community is being sustained as a whole. And our system has to be responsive to it, and to try to scale that up, to try to take up some of these actions. And then comes the question as well, which is another big question: which actions should we take up, and which ones should we not? And that's a very difficult question.
But one of the things you identify, and I realize we're running out of time now, but I think it's worth flagging, is that this is methodologically quite complicated insofar as you're weaving together quite complex system level, but also conceptual thinking, drawing from political theory, legal theory, political philosophy, these kinds of areas, with ethnographic or perhaps sociological, other kinds of social scientific work.
Yes, that's right. It's super difficult, but I think that's the right approach. I'm really sure that this is the right way to go. It's difficult, and sometimes I hope at some point I will also work with some people who are experts on other areas of knowledge, and then that's very helpful because then you can rely on them for certain things and so on. But yeah, it's a difficult project, but one that I think it's important to do.
Well, Pablo, I'd love to chat for hours, but we should probably move on to our regular questions. So every guest on Knowing Animals is offered 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes. There are I will say 2 because I read them sort of in tandem. So one was The Lives of Animals by Coetzee, a South African novelist. And the other one is The Animal That Therefore I Am by Jacques Derrida. I read them together for an undergrad essay I was writing, and they influenced me a lot.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I don't know if this counts as a scholarship, but it's definitely this essay I wrote when I was an undergrad. I never used the essay as such, but some of the ideas in that essay were in my PhD afterward.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I'm going to name 3 authors, although it's 2 because 2 of them go together. So one is Dinesh Wadiwell, who influenced me immensely with all these questions related to the triangle I spoke about at the very beginning: relationship between language, subjectivity, and violence, the recognition of violence. The war against animals in particular, the war against animals really influenced me. And then Sudan Olson and Will Kimlicka, who they co-author almost everything they write on animal politics. Their book Zoopolis, which I read when I was reading the war against animals. I was finishing the war against animals and I began Zoopolis at the same time. I say this because in terms of my career path or how my intellect changed, I often see them as 2 sides of the same coin. So Dinesh and Sue and Will, because also chronologically I read them at more or less at the same time. Yeah, that they changed my career, both the works of the 3 of them.
It's probably worth saying that when I was asked that question, my answer was Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka as well. And for listeners who aren't aware, both Pablo and I have been through the same postdoc when we both spent time at Queen's University working with Sue and Will. So I did mine 2016 to 2017. When was yours, Pablo?
2022, because thanks to you, thanks in part to you, I suppose, they turned the postdoc into a 2-year postdoc rather than 1. So I have that to thank you for, I suppose, a little bit at least.
And I hope the future holders of this position are listening, and I hope I can speak to you in the podcast in the future. But we'll carry on with our 5 quick questions. What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I was thinking of many things depending on what kind of academic one is. Like people like you and I think, can contribute differently than other colleagues of ours in the arts or doing media studies. It's very different. But I suppose something that perhaps most of us can do from our different angles, and I think this is really important, and you do a lot of this work through this podcast and other things, to influence public discourse. I really think it's really important to inform policymaking or influence it in some way, not to only, intellectual debates are good, but we need to reach policy and law. And then, which is what I have done in my work, but this is only one of the things that we can do, to deconstruct violence against animals on the one hand, and to imagine more just futures for human and non-human animals in an aspirational way and also in a very concrete way that can help our colleagues doing advocacy to kind of advance and get concrete results, and not only, doing intellectual work, which is really important too. But I think those are things that, but there are many other things.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Waddy speaks of human sovereignty over animals, understood as the right to decide over animals' lives. And I think if I had to choose one thing, would be to drop our sovereign right to decide over animals. So just to be because this may sound abstract, so very concretely, this right to decide involves things like assuming that we have the authority to determine with whom animals associate, where they go, when they can relieve themselves, or to break them so that they obey our orders, as it happens with the case of horses, say, when we train them, or of course killing them. All this stuff involves assuming dominion or sovereignty. And I think if we only just drop this, if we didn't assume we can decide over their lives, a lot would change only with that change.
What are you working on next?
So I'm right now working on a project that challenges is we are going to more or less end with the beginning. The idea that seeing is believing. So the idea that if people truly knew what happens in factory farms and so on, then political transformation would follow. The book will challenge that. And it will also propose a different, if you like, different campaign strategies that focus more on this idea of illuminating the rich lives of animals. So it's in a way an extended version of the article I published in the American Political Science Review. The article is called Why Seeing is Not Believing and Why Believing is Seeing.
And how can people find out more about your work?
They can find me on LinkedIn, or just, if you type my name and surname, you can email me, it will appear there. I also have accounts on ResearchGate and Google Scholar, so people can also try to find me there. Blue Sky, Twitter, all those places. If you type my name, you'll find me there.
Well, thanks so much, Pablo, for joining us for this podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Josh, for having me. It's been a pleasure. I always really enjoy talking with you and listening to you. So thank you so much, Josh, for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and you can follow me on X at Josh L. Milburn, on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher, and I'm on Blue Sky at Josh Milburn. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.